level like actions. And what reproductive justice brought to the table was really looking at the root causes of what's creating these problems and the focus on systemic change in addition to like individual and like interpersonal shifts. And that requires grappling with big things like racism and other things that influence our ability to realize reproductive justice. And then just to note that we cannot parent in safe and healthy communities without environmental justice. Like we cannot do one without the other. So when we talk about sustainable communities, when we talk about the health of our communities, when we talk about safety, we have to address the environment and also think more holistically about environment. I know, Gayla, you've told me so many times, like, it's not just water, it's not just air, like the environment is so much bigger than that. And I think I saw Valerie on the call who's doing the Black and Green Project at the New Georgia Project. And I heard the same thing from Valerie, like, and the environment, and when we talk about it, we have to think about everything that touches. And if we do talk about that and center people, then we'll naturally see how it touches all these other social justice issues and the importance of environmental justice when talking about those. And on the flip side, without achieving reproductive justice, without us like owning our bodies, without us having, being able to make decisions for our communities and families, and without economic empowerment, other social justice goals, we will not be able to fully realize environmental justice, and that as we improve in these other areas, and the environment will also benefit from this work if you're doing it from a justice framework. So that's kind of how I see, in broad strokes, these two frameworks intersecting. I do have a note at the bottom, because I have also done international work. I just really want to like make it clear that environmental justice and reproductive justice is not population control. Like, there's a really dark history from the reproductive health work of eugenics and population control, and using family planning, using forced sterilization to decrease Black and Brown communities or low-income communities, like birth rates. And so I always get a little squeamish when we're talking about, especially like climate change, because all of a sudden, a lot of climate change folks care a lot about birth control and abortion, and it's thinly veiled population control at its best. And so that is to say that the decision is in the hands of the people, and the point of doing reproductive justice and talking about reproductive justice and environmental justice is not to shrink population size, it's to empower people to make decisions for themselves. And that inherently, whether or not people choose to have children or not, is going to benefit us long term. And that like there is no space for population control, and that is not like, the birth rate is not even like near any of our goals when we talk about this work. So this slide is just to capture a little bit more about like our communities and what Amplify, and I'm sure other folks have seen in doing the work. I just wanted, this is not my area of expertise, but I just wanted to start off by saying like where we live is shaped by racism, like everywhere. And especially so in Atlanta. I figure like people on this call are familiar with the practice of redlining, but it's basically like discriminatory practices around lending, but other social services too. I believe in the 80s that were like, I mean, there were sanctioned practices. So like banks would not lend to certain communities, and these were people of color, and these were low income communities. And what it did is it just entrenched wealth in certain communities, and this was delineated by geography. So it's set in like a very racial kind of discrimination across cities, and like pushing communities into certain neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods being under-resourced. And this has continued to impact how our cities look now. And when we talk about environmental degradation, when we talk about these toxins, you'll see they often impact certain communities and not others. And that is by design. And people often have to live in these communities because of these discriminatory practices. And the same thing with the predatory loans that were happening in the early 2000s, where they would provide the subprime loans and like specifically target certain communities. And then when the financial crisis hit, those were the communities that were most impacted, and those were the ones that bore the brunt of eviction. And we continue to see that today. And then the wonderful topic of gentrification, which is like on everyone's lips. It's continuing to happen. I think a great example of that is what's happening in Peoplestown. And that's like coupled with eminent domain and also with flooding, which is related to environmental justice. So gentrification is continuing to push communities into out of like historic communities and into like further and further out of the city, which creates other issues. And also just creating incredible like shelterlessness. So the next note was where we live impacts our health and well-being. So I just provided a couple examples of like, there's a statistic I was reading about of basically, okay, my dog just charged me, sorry. So like Black communities in Atlanta have around almost like 10 doctors per 10,000 people, whereas like predominantly white communities have about 25. So if you look at that statistic, where you live determines how you access healthcare and how readily you can access it. And that compounds things like maternal mortality, which we know is a huge issue in Georgia. Georgia is the leading state, has the highest rate of maternal death, and it is 2 to 3 times higher for Black mamas and people of color, but specifically Black mamas. It also determines whether you can access food. So we know West Atlanta is a huge food desert, and this impacts health and nutrition, and that nutrition impacts birth outcomes. So it all is connected. Environmental toxins and the water and air. I could like go on too long about this, but like lead is a big issue in West Atlanta. There's been a lot of conversation about how there is a ton of lead in the ground, and people are going out with their kids are digging in the dirt, people are gardening, and they're getting exposed to lead. Lead in the water, we're finding in our schools. Again, like this is more so in low income areas. And then there's the whole conversation around the ethylene oxide in South Fulton coming, that's in the air from the sterilization plants and is causing cancer. And the fact that it has gone like wholly unregulated and very intentionally so. There's also other things that we've heard from community is stuff around safety, like people talking about vacant houses, illegal dumping, poor lighting in apartment buildings, and landlords that will not maintain apartment buildings, so they become very unsafe, especially in immigrant communities in Clarkston. This is surfacing a lot, and just people being like, this is not a place that we feel comfortable like raising our children, and yet it is the only options they have. And for many folks being immigrants, they feel especially vulnerable in raising this, or unable to because they don't speak the language. And then I didn't put this note here, but also like stress and trauma. There's been studies that talk about like noise pollution and other things that can impact your stress and anxiety level. And we know that can impact especially pregnant people, and that this anxiety can be passed down to children. And that's like a less commonly discussed thing. And then I wanted to put a note here about climate change just disproportionately impacting the most marginalized. We see it time and again, natural disasters hit low-income communities that are in flood zones much harder. Regular flooding is becoming a justification for displacing people, like in Peoplestown. And then the coronavirus, like pandemics and the spread of disease as the climate is heating is going to become more and more common. And again, this disproportionately impacts low-income folks who like have to go to work or are the caregivers. And we know that that's a huge, huge burden. Black and brown women predominantly provide caregiving in our like health aides, and are really having to be at the forefront of this virus, being paid like minimum wage. So my final note, just to wrap up, is to say that this is literally a matter of life and death. A recent study that was done, or article that was published, was that Buckhead residents live 20 years longer than Bankhead residents, which is to say that environment plus these other like historic injustices compound to impact our ability to live and to live long and healthy lives, and that it's reproductive health outcomes, but it's also just broader health and survival that we need to be talking about as we talk about these other issues. That's it for me.